Hello colleagues, and welcome to this 6th video on this channel. My name is Joe Strahl, and I teach environmental studies at the University of Malmö. I pre-record some of my lectures at the university. I pre-record them using one or more cameras, tripods, lenses, extra batteries, and so forth. Generally, when I pre-record my lectures, I have 2 or 3 or 4 of the pre-recorded lectures that could be of varying lengths. The students can watch these at their leisure, and then later that day, later that week, I have a question and answer session on Zoom where students can ask me questions if they need clarity around a particular issue or issues.
Perhaps you might be interested in doing the same thing. You might be interested in pre-recording one or more of your lectures. This has advantages and disadvantages when we can't be on campus. However, it's a very practical way to deal with communicating with students and being able to have complete control of the situation and know exactly what the students see and hear, as opposed to, for example, Zoom, where we don't know what the students' settings are when they're actually watching something. And yes, there are improvements in Zoom, of course, as we know. But still, we could have Zoom situations where the screen is mostly filled with a PowerPoint and the instructor is this tiny little box someplace, unfortunately. So in a previous video, I talked about the advantages and disadvantages of, on the one hand, having in-class learning, as we have had in the past on campus. On the other hand, having Zoom-based teaching and learning, and then somewhere in the middle, perhaps combining some of the digital elements from Zoom in a pre-recorded lecture and also having the interaction possibility with Zoom or some other kind of application when it comes to teaching and learning digitally. And I think that a combination of all of these kinds of things in the future would be hybrid higher education. If you haven't seen that lecture that I did before, talking about the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, you might want to watch that, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this video below. If you might be interested in using one or more system cameras to be able to pre-record content that students can see and hear at scheduled times, can be able to see it again when they want to if they're unsure, or at times that are more convenient for them, not regularly scheduled classroom times, then this video might be for you. Because in this video, I'm going to begin to take up a list of things that you might want to consider when you might be in the market for buying a system camera and all the other things that we required. What are important things to consider? Here are my thoughts and experiences.
First is the question of cost. Obviously, everything is going to cost something, and if you're not paying for it out of your own pocket, then it is your university that has the money someplace to pay for this. And regardless if you're buying this as a private person or if the university is buying it, there has to be some kind of a budget. There has to be some kind of limitations. Second, there's the question of use. How are you going to be using this? Oh, I'm going to be pre-recording lectures just like Joe does on this channel that I watch and so forth. Yes and no. I teach mostly environmental studies. That means that parts of some of my lectures are recorded outdoors. You might never record anything indoors. And recording outdoors, perhaps there's the threat of rain. That would suggest that at least some of your equipment must be so-called weather sealed. If you're always going to be indoors, then that doesn't matter. There's never going to be any drizzle on your equipment, and there'll be no problems with the electronics. That's an example of how my choices and my needs may be similar or may be very different to your choices and your needs. Another possibility. I seldom take pictures as a private person with my equipment, or film for myself, or film for the university in low light situations. Right now I'm in a northern room in my house, and it's the middle of the day, and it's April, and it's a very sunny day. So if we have a focus
on pre-recorded lectures, haha, pun intended, of focus on pre-recorded lectures, then there are things that you may or may not be thinking that you would need to use your camera for. Because I teach environmental studies, I have reason sometimes to have my or some of my equipment with me at a nature preserve or some other place where even if it's not raining, it might have rained before and there's still water in the treetops, and occasionally there's some wind and there's sort of like rain falling on my equipment. That means that at least some of my equipment needs to be so-called weather sealed.
But you may always film indoors. And in that case, you don't need weather-sealed equipment. On the other hand, you might be somebody that sometimes for teaching will have situations where the light is relatively low.
So that means that you will need equipment, sensors and lenses that permit you to film in low light circumstances. Or you could bring additional light with you. And in that case, the cameras and the sensors and the lenses don't matter quite as much. And I'll get more into that in another video at a later point in time. Now, I'm not going to say that you're never going to film outdoors. You might.
You might do it very seldom, and you might decide that you'll do it when there's no risk to your equipment. No rain, mostly cloudless sky, hasn't rained recently, or whatever it is. So that could also be an option. You have equipment that lets you do certain things, but it also limits you. And that actually is what everyone is faced with. We have certain limitations and we have certain possibilities. But it behooves you, who is watching this, to think about the uses and potential uses of equipment to make pre-recorded lectures, or taking some of this equipment and using it as a webcam or whatever for Zoom, if that's also what you might be doing. So personally, I have one weather-sealed camera and one unweather-sealed camera, and I have not a weather-sealed lens on this non-weather-sealed camera, and a weather-sealed lens on that camera over there.
And I have at least one other weather-sealed lens. So with that camera and those two lenses, I'm pretty much all set for most things that I might want to do outdoors, except take extremely close and blown up pictures of flowers or something like that. But for most general photography and videography to be outdoors, I have more or less what would be useful for me personally,
and for my teaching needs. There might be some special circumstance I haven't thought about before, but then maybe I'll just film that indoors. And I was on site and took some pictures and then included those pictures into the instructional video. That's also a possibility. In which case, I can just handheld carry my camera and take those pictures relatively easily. And if there's a risk of it getting damaged or a problem with the elements, I could always put the camera under a rain jacket for a while.
When we're thinking about this, or when you are thinking about cameras and you're thinking about possibility of having a system camera with lenses and microphones, in this case a wired microphone, and this could improve some of the quality in your teaching, let some of your engagement shine through the little keyhole that I've talked about before. And in this instance, you need to think about a few things. And that's what this video is going to be about. Some of the things that you need to think about. So, if we think about a situation that many of us have been faced with, we have a number of students in a course and they're all going to be writing papers and the papers are 10 or 12 or 15 pages long or whatever they are. And you have tutorial sessions with the students, or you have PhD students who do that for you, or other kinds of assistants, or whatever it is that you're doing. And what are usually the papers that are bad? Well, of course, somebody might not be very good at the language they're writing it in. That's one matter. But what do most of us think is a bit of a problem? Of course, there's a terrible purpose, or there is no purpose, and the student just writes stuff and nothing sticks together and so forth like that. And if there's no purpose, then the whole paper suffers. And what can we do? And students who are unwilling to see this might not last very long in a university until they mature or begin to understand this.
But now you are the student, and you might be interested in getting a system camera.
And in that case, what is your purpose? What are you going to use it for, and why? And why you're going to use this setup as opposed to doing other forms of teaching, be it if it was pre-COVID-19, pre-pandemic, when we were usually on campus, in-person teaching, versus during the pandemic, when most of us were spending most of the time sitting in chairs teaching on Zoom, when we perhaps should be standing when we're teaching. I will say this over and over again, yeah? Maybe we should be standing most of the time when we're teaching, and maybe the students can see a bit more of us than just a talking head. You need to have your understanding of what you're going to use the camera or cameras and equipment for, and why this gives something which otherwise would not be possible when it comes to other forms of teaching, other media, so to speak. And you don't have to have a complete idea, because a purpose can start out on the paper and then the student may modify that on the way. Just like you start out with certain ideas about the use and why you're going to be using the camera or cameras in a particular way, and then through use you start to modify that a bit as you just start to discover certain things and certain possibilities, and you're willing to experiment. For example, like I'm doing today, I have two cameras and I'm alternating between looking at them like this to see how, if this seems more engaging. It's going to be a lot of work editing this afterwards, but it'll be interesting to see what it ended up being like. So I think that considering what I'm saying about uses and students and purposes, I think it's very important that you, right now, pause this video and take half a minute to think about these things that I've been mentioning. And then you can continue. And then I will continue with some more specific kinds of thoughts that I have, besides cost and besides use that I was talking about before. Now, a third matter to consider is sensor size and megapixels and image resolution. I'm going to talk a lot about that in a specific complementary video to this that has the name or number 6b. And this is number 6. But for the moment, I'll say a few things about that, and then return to this later in the video, and then there's the 6b to look at in more detail. What kind of video resolution you need, and what kind of camera and other equipment you need to achieve that, that can be a rather vexing series of questions for some people. And if you're entirely new to this, then you don't really know at this point in time. But this video is supposed to help you a bit, at least that's my hope. As a complete novice, you may be in the thrall of a good friend or acquaintance who already has a system camera. Your friend may recommend a camera similar to what she or he already has, or based on this friend's needs and experiences, which may have nothing to do with teaching in higher education, and this will be recommended to you. And initially, if you go out and get this, or ask your university to buy this, or whatever it is that you're doing here, it could be that your good friend or acquaintance has no experience of the various types of systems in system cameras and may have only experience from using one particular brand. And again, you may feel satisfied in the beginning, but at some point in time, as you begin seeing if the equipment you have and your uses and needs and the possibilities for students and so forth, you might discover that there is a bit of a mismatch here. And in fact, your friend may actually be doing you a disservice, which you do not realize until much later.
In my opinion, you and essentially everyone else in 2021 who is teaching and helping students learn in higher education, you do not need a sensor with better resolution than 16 megapixels on a system camera, and you don't need image resolution when you're filming to more than what is referred to as 1080p. 1080p is that you have 1080 lines of pixels in the image that the person, your students, are watching, and 1920 rows. 1920 columns of pixels. So you have 1080 by 1920. That's what I am filming when I'm using that camera. I am filming with a 20 megapixel camera when I'm using this camera.
I don't know about your laptop, but the highest resolution on my laptop is 1080p. This means that there are 1080 lines, rows of pixels, and 1920 columns of pixels. This is an HD kind of screen, just like you can have an HD television. We could refer to this as a 1K screen because of there being approximately 1000 pixels when it comes from the top to the bottom. If our students will be seldom viewing us in anything larger than a 13 or a 15-inch laptop screen, any video with resolution higher than the screen might be a bit of an overkill. So, let that sink in for a little bit about the risk of having massive overkill in the system that you acquire. Consider also that the more megapixels that you have in your sensor, the larger the file size is going to be of the resulting video take that you've made. If I have a 50-minute lecture which is broken up in the middle with a pause and the students are working on something else, I might talk for 10 minutes and then I might talk for 15 minutes, and then we have the pause where the screen is blank for a few seconds while they're supposed to be working, and then I come back and anticipate the things that the student might be thinking about for 5 minutes, but after they've thought about that, and then maybe I take things on to the next level, so to speak. And that means I need to cut these various takes together and put it into one big film. And I'm using my laptop, and the larger the files are, with the greater resolution in them, the more taxing this is going to be on the software and on your computer. The greater resolution you have, the more frames per second you have, and I'll get back to that, the size of your files will skyrocket. And it will also mean if a student that is watching your pre-recorded lecture has not so good internet connection, then they might feel frustrated. And frustrated students are not students that you've engaged. And frustrated students will be dissatisfied, will not learn as much, and so forth. That means bad quality. So this could mean that those of us who think that more megapixels means better quality, it could be the opposite, or at least in 2021. So if you're forcing your students with a poor internet connection to watch 4K video as opposed to 1080p, or even worse, 8K video, where there's almost no monitors that exist right now that a student could afford that are 8K video, then you are doing your students a disservice. You want to improve the quality of the video that you produce, and preferably also include the sound of the video that you're producing. But you don't want to bring it to such a high level that it becomes like an inverse U. I'm doing certain things and the quality is improving, but because I'm making the quality even better, actually the quality in other sense is declining. So we want to make sure that the students' experience of seeing us is improved compared to just having a simple webcam, by having better audio and by having better visual quality, both the camera and the sensor and the lenses, but also our lighting. And our positioning and so forth. And if we don't have that in consideration, then it will be less interesting and less engaging for our students. So I hope I've managed to convince you that more megapixels is not always better, because we have some sort of a limitation in the final analysis, a keyhole, although a much larger keyhole when it comes to the screens that the students will be watching us on, and their internet connection, of course. But if I haven't convinced you, let me tell you a few other things that might help to convince you. And then you can always watch also the 6B video as well. First of all, besides what I've already said, how often do you watch YouTube besides this? In 2021, the overwhelming majority of videos on YouTube are at 1080p or lower quality. Yes, there are so-called 2.7K and 4K videos, but these are an extreme minority. And until the majority of people have devices in their room or in their hands that can be 4K, then there's no point. 2, besides YouTube, because you might put some of your content on YouTube instead of putting on a streaming service that your university has, consider when you are on Zoom.
Consider when you are on Zoom. Yes, we all are on Zoom, and from time to time we're absolutely sick of it. But consider when you are on Zoom. You're at a faculty meeting, or you have students, and if you're lucky you have at most 20 students on the screen and you have a chance to interact with them, as opposed to having 100 students and only half of them show up, or whatever. What is the visual quality on Zoom? Have you ever considered that? Zoom has designed its service so that your image is never, ever better than 1080p. So as soon as you have probably a more expensive camera with a larger sensor and a larger and a better image quality that you're filming in, like 4K, then all of that is going to be dumbed down and put into the same kind of image quality that you would have with everybody else of your colleagues on Zoom.
So what I'm trying to suggest here is that 1080p is good enough. Better video quality in terms of the image sensor, the number of pixels and so forth, won't help you if the students are not viewing it on a better kind of viewing situation. And considering that what you've been seeing here, that one camera is 16 megapixel sensor and the other is 20, and there doesn't seem to be a tremendous difference between them, then maybe, and if you think this is good enough, then maybe you think also that 16, at most 20, is probably good enough. In this case, more is not better. Well, compared to the webcam that's built into your laptop and the microphone on your laptop, this is a lot more and it's much better. But we reach a point of diminishing returns and where we have some sort of not only diminishing returns, we actually start to have negatives that creep into this. I've been talking about sensor size and that this can vary from camera to camera. Sensors are one of the key components that make up specific systems in system cameras. Of course, the other part of a system camera is that you have lenses that you can take off and put back on and so forth, and switch depending upon your needs, how far away you are filming something or taking pictures, as opposed to your cell phone, which has certain limitations. And for the foreseeable future, unless it either has zoom lenses on it, which would make a very bulky kind of cell phone or smartphone, or if it has 5 or 6 cameras studded all over the back, making it harder to hold, okay, that doesn't seem like that's the way we want to go if the purpose behind a cell phone is, or a smartphone is primarily to talk and look. We can film, of course. Among system cameras, there are 3 main sensor sizes which help define the system. Here I'm going to interchangeably talk about 35mm film equivalent as sometimes full frame sensors, sometimes as small format sensors. In the 6B video, it'll be called full format all the time. My intention is that from the 7th video and forward, I'll primarily be calling them small format. We have APS-C, the sensors are smaller. And then we have micro four thirds, where the sensors are still smaller. The sensors in a micro four thirds camera or an APS-C camera or in a small format or full frame camera, these are much bigger than sensors that you would have in your smartphone. And combined with the fantastic optics in the lens, you get fantastic images. And combining better microphones than what you have built in the camera or in your smartphone, then you have much better audio quality. Now we could include other kinds of systems here. Let's bring these back. Starting from the smallest micro four thirds, again, APS-C, and then small format or full frame. There are larger system camera sensor systems, medium format and large format. Those that talk about small format as full frame, they like to look down at APS-C and micro four thirds and say they're cropped sensors. They're not as good because they're cropped. The language we use to describe things, of course, influences how we think about things. But if you have a medium format sensor and you look at full format, or you're looking at that as small format, that's a cropped sensor too. And medium format is a cropped sensor compared to the large format. But come on, we're not going to be doing Hollywood productions. We don't need a large format. Plus, maybe the money could be better spent on something else. Generally speaking, and I'll say this again, the smaller the size of the sensor in the camera, the less expensive it will be to make certain things, And this, of course, will be passed on to the consumer, meaning that, by and large, lower down we are on the list, the less expensive the cameras will be to purchase. Also, lenses for the cameras, the smaller the sensor, the smaller the mount that the lens goes onto, the smaller the lens in general. Now, that isn't always the case. Here's a very small lens for a micro four thirds system. And here's a very large lens for a micro four thirds system. If this lens extended was for a small format, full frame camera, if it was an equivalent lens and equivalent reach, the top part of the lens hood would be going out of the picture and it would weigh a lot more. I like convenience and lightweight if I'm going to be leaving home and filming and taking pictures. Photographers that have full frame don't think that's important. So a medium format camera and equipment is probably beyond your budget. And I could imagine your department head, or depending on how things are organized, your dean saying, "What? You want to buy a camera for this much?" I mean, you could, if you bought a medium format camera without a lens, you could probably buy 2 or 3 micro four thirds cameras or APS-C cameras with a number of lenses and 2 tripods and a professional grade microphone and some lighting. You'd have your whole kit for everything that you could possibly need. Well, almost anything you could possibly need. But with a medium format, you'd have a fantastic camera, but you wouldn't be able to take any pictures. So that's probably not where you want to go. So I think we can collapse this down, that we just have small format or full frame, APS-C, and micro four thirds kinds of system cameras that could be of possible interest for you. Finally, a fifth point, besides cost, use, sensor size. What were my points? Finally, besides cost, use, megapixels, sensor size, we come to a fifth point. There are additional points, but for this video, I'm just going to stop here with this fifth point here. And that has to do with ergonomics and the ease of use of the camera that you get or you consider getting. Now, there's a bit of a problem here, because you cannot know how easy it is to use a camera until you've tried it. Now, if you've tried several cameras from different manufacturers and with different sensor systems, then you start to get a sense of things, and you could probably watch 3 or 4 YouTube videos of other camera models that you've never used and say, aha, this camera they're talking about fits somewhere in between this one and this one, which I already know about. And so therefore, I assume it's like this. But my assumption is, dear listener, dear watcher, that you're very much a novice in this area. And so, you really should not buy your camera online, unless you trust every YouTube video you've ever seen. I would suggest that buying a camera online where you've never touched and used it Think about this. Some people have medium-sized hands, others smaller, still others large hands. A person with small hands might not find a large chunky camera the best to use. A person with very large hands might find many of the buttons and dials on some kinds of system cameras to be too small. So by all means, get a second opinion when it comes to cameras. But I think there should be some criteria that you think about, or things that are important when you go to get a second or a third opinion, particularly if you're going to talk to people and not just watch videos on YouTube. First of all, I think the person that you ask should have knowledge of more than one type of system camera. In other words, systems. Be they small format or sometimes called full frame, APS-C or micro four thirds. If this person has only experience and has never considered any other kind of system, then that person might be more biased. So it should be preferably somebody who has actual experience using these other systems and not just one particular kind. If you ask somebody for a recommendation about a motor vehicle or a car and they've only driven one brand their entire life, they're going to recommend that, even though there might be features in other vehicles that would be better. So, someone with sufficient experience with more than one kind of system, more than one kind of brand, would be very beneficial and less likely to give you a biased opinion. Second, if you have a person who has bought equipment and has been using it for pre-recorded lectures, that person may have gone through a thought process leading to an intelligent consumer decision. Or if the person already had equipment and then sort of started using it for pre-recorded lectures or using it on Zoom or whatever they were doing. And third, I think it might be a good idea to look at a few more lectures before. It might be a good idea to look at a few more of the videos on this channel before you turn to somebody for a second or a third or a fourth opinion. Of course, there are a lot of camera reviews. You can find these on the part of the manufacturers, you can find these on the part of influencers and so forth on YouTube. And the question is, to what extent are they biased? Some YouTube reviewers of equipment and cameras are very honest and make disclaimers. I don't own this, I borrowed this, or I bought this with my own money, or manufacturer X sent this to me and said I could do a review and I get to keep it, and so forth. And of course, we as academics, and we think about that there can be bias in somebody's research, well, there could be bias in camera reviews. To try to show you that maybe I'm not so biased, this is my first system camera. It's a Lumix camera, a GX9. I would suggest it's not the best camera for using for pre-recorded lectures. And the reason for that, the primary reason, is that there's no microphone jack to put a microphone directly into it. You can use it as a secondary camera, but you can use it perhaps as a secondary camera, but I would not suggest using it as your primary camera for video. Another camera will be much better for that. If you speak to somebody who's already bought into a particular system, they've brought into a particular brand with the lenses and the sensor, and they've used that a lot, this person has made a financial investment. This person has made a skills and knowledge investment, hours and hours and hours of time into something like this. And if you speak to this person, and you speak to this person about your needs and so forth, then this person might say, well, I think I've got the perfect camera for you, and it might be a camera from the same brand, from the same kind of sensor, but have somewhat different features. Because this person is recommending something similar to what she or he already knows. But it might be a good idea to broaden the perspective. I would suggest to you that if someone says that you have to have a lot of dynamic range in your pre-recorded videos, you probably don't. And you've already heard about when it comes to about sensor size and so forth. You probably don't need something like that. but your third or fourth opinion might say something completely different. You must have at least 40 megapixels. You must, and so forth like that. Maybe you don't must have some of those things. A related point here, tying back into ergonomics, is that if you look at advertisements for cameras that most manufacturers make, you see the person going around taking pictures and smiling and so forth, and they're in taking pictures of wildlife, or in the center of the city taking pictures of sights and crowds and so forth. But seldom they talk about ease of use and ergonomics. You're running the risk of buying a camera which has fantastic technical specifications, but when you start to use it, you discover that the menu system is just weird and doesn't work for you. Of course, after some time of using a particular camera with a particular menu system, most of us start to get used to it and can skip around, and we don't have to use all the options. But rumor has it that some menu systems on some cameras are better than others, and that might be something to investigate before you take the plunge and make a decision. Thanks for today. Thank you for watching. If I've managed to convince you that you don't need many quadrillion megapixels and that 1080p filming is good enough, then thank you. If I haven't convinced you, you might consider watching 6B, the sort of companion film to this, and there'll be a link to that in the description of this YouTube video. If you like the content on this channel, consider giving it a thumbs up. That way you can sort of tickle the algorithm in YouTube, and that might mean that more people would find this channel if they would find it helpful, and if you find it helpful for you. I'm not an 18 or 20-year-old person on YouTube who wants to be an influencer and churn out 3 or 4 videos per week. I haven't the time, I haven't the interest. Instead, as some of you know already, or perhaps have suspect, this channel poses the question that I would have posed to myself at the time: what would I have liked to have known about in January 2020 before the pandemic started? And knowing that, I could have hit the ground running and not be always dependent upon, say, Zoom. I didn't know many things. There were certain things I was completely clueless about, and this channel helps to answer some of those questions. I hope that this channel helps answer some of your questions. You might have some questions in your mind that you have not brought up with your colleagues, or maybe you have, about what is a new normal going to be like. This way you will be better prepared for whatever this is, and if in 5 years a new pandemic rolls around, not entirely unimpossible, then you'll be better prepared for that. Or if there's something else which turns up, which means that we can't be on campus very often. So stay safe, and thank you again for today.